Hi, I'm Jennifer England here on Weave and here in the traditional territories of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Ta'an Kwachan Council in Whitehorse, Yukon. And I have the great honor of introducing our conversation today with Cecily Nicholson, a dear friend and esteemed poet of Wayside Saying, Triage, and From the Poplars. She won the Governor General's Award for English Language Poetry in 2018 for Wayside Saying. Not only is she a poet, but she is an activist and social convener of incredible collaboration, and somebody I've deeply admired for both her politics, her empathy, her sharp social analysis, and her exemplification of being a leader of incredible integrity. And here in my work, integrity, influence, and impact for social change is really at the heart of leadership and systems change making. So what I love about this conversation is she's weaving together her love of poetry and her deep commitment in her work in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And so enjoy this conversation, and I'd love you to write in or tell me what you think of this conversation, what's inspired in you. And with this, enjoy. So welcome, Cecily. Thanks for being on Weave.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Cecily Nicholson, an award-winning author of 3 books of poetry, a volunteer with community impacted by carcerality and food insecurity, with performances, talks, and residencies that have been hosted from a host of educational spaces like New York's University, the Tisch School of Arts, the Center for Indigenous Research Creation at Queen's University, the Woodland Pattern Book Center in Milwaukee, and the Surrey School District, among many others. Your being and wisdom and poetry are being sought all over North America. And it is just such an honor to have you here on Weave with me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, and places, I suppose they're seeking me out, but it's also I am seeking places out as well. Like it's really where I want to spend time with these qualities places. So yourself included, Jen, and just really excited to hear more about your query and your practice as well. So
yeah, well, I was so inspired to have you on Weave, and you and I were just chatting before this got recorded. And I think for me, we've been longtime friends from the early days in the early 2000s in the downtown east side community in Vancouver, Canada. And for me, you've been one of those incredible leaders that has lived your politics and your values with such great humility and deep commitment. And I think so many people, and I know so many of the leaders that I've been talking with all over the world, I mean, everyone's just feeling so exhausted by not only the pandemic, but also by the mounting fear and anxiety around, and the anguish around things feeling like they're getting worse with sort of crumbling democracy. And as we've seen in the last week in the United States, the siege on Capitol Hill. So I think for me, it's like, how do we explore again this sort of intersection between the change we want to see, the systems change, with leadership and our inner growth? And you have been writing and working in the realms of resistance and solidarity. I think for you, that's been really huge lineage through all of your work. So I'm just so excited to talk to you and learn and really explore, like, how do we stay in? How do we stay in as leaders and continue to engage when everything feels so much? So I'd love to kind of maybe start with, like, how are you navigating these times? The pandemic, how are you doing? And what, maybe to start, like, what's been the most surprising gift for you in this pandemic?
So again, thank you for the lovely, kind words you have to share about your observations of my practice. And I wanted to say, first of all, that what keeps me in and what I continue to learn about is the small scale. I think it's important to think with vision and perspective and large scale organizational, governmental, these kind of frameworks and systems change. But really, we live in the everyday. And so all of our interactions, from our family to our neighbors to our workmates or the stranger that we pass in the street, they all matter to me. And it's not that they matter necessarily equally, but I definitely want to bring the same quality of attention, engagement, and concern and empathy to all the mundane spaces, not just sort of the grand kind of moments of, so just, I guess that's an aside, but the pandemic, wow. Well, I mean, I can't recall if I've shared with you, but I think I did, that we began the pandemic with the loss of a parent, my husband's mom. And so really, as those of you who know have gone through that, which is many of us, and many of us will continue, grief is a particular thing. And then grief at this time, very strange. So not being able to gather, not being able to go through the normal social mores that are there to help us kind of flesh out our emotions and share those and be comforted. So I think that the pandemic began with some really hard lessons around grief. Not a stranger to grief personally, but this was definitely a new experience. And I've had a few waves, and I think many of us have, like, we're in this mode and then we're in this mode. I would say where I am now, 10 months on, is very grateful, in a very grateful position. I feel strong. I feel healthy. I have a home. I have good connections socially. I've managed to hold down a really wonderful job. So I can see that I have all of these privileges and all of these things that have been solid in my life at this very difficult time. So I feel a deep gratitude. And things have slowed down in some ways and sped up in others. So it's an interesting moment to really reflect on the rhythms of things and the cadence of things. Things that have slowed down, things like commuting or our communication somehow. I'm using the telephone again. It's like, so, for calls, not for taking pictures or whatever. So it's interesting sort of repurposing of things that were actually quite old and timeless in certain ways. But other things are speeding up. And so the scale, I think, that we're working at when we're trying to sort through problems and troubleshoot at this time. So right now, for example, in local community, we're setting out to organize the annual Women's Memorial March. You may know this is in its 30th year this year. I've been a part of that organizing for 20 years. And I've been a part of coordinating with the Guardians. So, my very humble privilege to work with Guardians in the March for, 10, 15 years. And it's always quite a bit of logistics. There's always a lot of work that goes into working primarily with women identified members of who relate to the downtown East Side community. So we come with all of our challenges. But on top of that, of course, now we're having to deal with, social distancing. Like, how do we even have a meeting? And I can, on a side and another time, explain to you how that ended up breaking down. You'll know. And so, like, the Carnegie Theater is mobilized, and some, we have this amount of kind of outreach happening, and here's this and that. But it's challenging. And then on top of that, of course, we're going to still march in Memorial because the community wants to do it. And that's why we do it. We do it as this profound shared collective grief. This is an outlet and a necessity for that community. So, so the scales in which, we're learning new skill sets, actually. And while they pose themselves, the problems pose as difficulties, and they pose as things that have to be surmounted or figured out. But I'm not lost. The lesson is not lost in me that I'm also learning new ways to do things that I've been doing the same way for 15 years, for example, in this example. So, and I think sorry, would you like to talk?
No, what I find really amazing about sort of that initial reflection on the pandemic and and your grief, and I'm so sorry to hear the loss of your mother-in-law. I knew about that from before, and just how in some ways we're so challenged with how do we ritualize and come together in such a way that can really meet the deep longing of the heart to feel met, and in some ways at a family scale, it's challenged, and yet what you're then sharing is just this amazing intention that still will not subside, even in the face of the threat of COVID to people who are marginalized and have significantly compromised immune systems. This like new ritual around how do we still come together for the Women's March. I just think that's such an amazing, the both and of grieving in new ways of being in community.
Yeah, those are some good points. It's an interesting way to reframe it. And I think, interestingly, so one of the things that as a guardian in the march, you're a helper, but you're also wanting to be there to de-escalate and to limit harm and ensure or stop if there's harmful situations. That's one of the main goals, is safety. And so to add this profound goal of a community that's deeply impacted by disability, deeply impacted by chronic health problems and compromised immune systems, among other things. So it's this added level. And then, as you know, the march is led by elders with medicine and matriarchs with drums, all of whom in the context of the downtown east side would be understood as seniors. We use vehicles to move people around with limited mobility. All of those logistics are at play. But the march, this isn't my example. This is, we learn from these things that we were involved in. But the Memorial March, of course, has all these things on its list. And it's like, okay, well, we need PPE. So this year, in addition to doing regalia, sewing and ribbon dresses and all the work around armbands, instead of armbands, we have masks. There will be masks for community members, using and drawing on the skills of sewers and people in the community and artists. And so, it's just these little moments, but they matter in terms of how we greet these problems. And then the fact is that, you can't stop an elder. You can't. You don't stand in front of an elder. You stand behind or beside, if you respect that and you respect medicine. And so we take that leadership, and that leadership has not wavered at the time of COVID. And if anything, it has become more frontline. So I do know also a number of people who are working very hard to strengthen the vaccinations of a number of people prior to the end of this month. And some of the people that I work with who will be coming in, it doesn't mean that they can't carry the virus, but it does mean that potentially their own health risks are diminished. So this is, it's a complex thing, but there's a lot going on, and it's not stopped. And that's, I think, is I don't want to romanticize being inspired by things, but there's lots of lessons there. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that the beautiful imagery of the beating of the masks, shifting from armbands to masks, and maybe it's a both and, but just this beautiful way of the simple everyday and weaving together the cultural spaces and the ways that art bring us together in solidarity and in service to something beautiful, in such a, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Women's March, I mean, it's really Vancouver's downtown east side community way of acknowledging and being with the sisters and grandmothers and friends that have been murdered or gone missing. And obviously in Canada, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls issue has been on the top radar for Indigenous women for decades and decades, with really the downtown east side community taking a great deal of leadership with that. And so thank you for starting there, because the pandemic doesn't stop inequality. And as you say, there's new ways that we're having to learn how to be with one another, such that the solidarity and we can meet the everyday, and we can meet the everyday in order to change some of the systemic issues that are still causing displacement and inequality. But I'd love, maybe just I'd love you to talk a little bit about, like, social change work has been a part of your life for ever since I've known you, and I know it had early starts. So could you speak to some of your early motivations where social change work became a part of your being, a part of your bones?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't take a lot of opportunity to reflect, I think, on the youthful origins of that kind of work for me. I wonder if I just wanted to add one more reflection on what we were thinking about before, in terms of the resistance and resilience and decades and decades, but really centuries and centuries of response from Indigenous people, nations, and women in a frontline way relative to the nation state and sort of the colonization of this whole massive island. And I think it matters in the conversation of the virus and pandemic when we think about the history of disease and pandemic related to smallpox. So when you literally have 90% of your community killed in the context. So I would say that generationally, there's other wisdoms and knowledges that are really deep. So I know you think that through too, but I just maybe for our folks who's joining us for this conversation, like we remember that. In terms of my origins for the idea of social justice, I do think it began in the sense of family. I come through systems of care, as a ward of the state initially, and relinquished. I came through a young mom who was street involved and involved in similar industries that I might work alongside in the downtown east side, and a kind of early sense of displacement. So I had a number of homes before I landed in an adopted home, which I was there for about 15 years. And I grew up in a rural context. And I think that quite matters as you know or have some sense of the deep sense of values around labor and the cycles of weather and climate and seasons and the meaning of all of that in our everyday takes a greater hold when you're in a rural environment. So I feel like my early lessons around what mattered, what was a sense of home, the necessity to build strong social relations if they don't exist in your family, in the ways that you need, self-education, having to work off-grid from a young age to make sure that elements that reflected my lineage and social experience were evident in the pedagogy and classroom spaces, because they were not in rural southwestern Ontario, the opposite in some ways, quite racist content historically. And so all of those things, those skills that come from just making sure that you have a dignified space to hold, translated into activism, so-called. I don't really use that idea of activism or activist, because I do think it is a way of being socially involved that is just sort of a regular way of life. It's not this sort of exceptional state of heroics. It's sort of, being there and standing there with your own dignity in mind, but also your community and your networks and collective work. And so early on realized that there were groups of people that gathered around things, that it was possible to work on broader campaigns. I did in the family that I grew up with on that farm, they were environmentalists and very much in the 70s and 80s sense of that. And so we were busy trying to preserve wetlands, and we were fighting the cutting down of a tree, or we were saving money and sending it off to save the whales, and all of these things that are somewhat neoliberal kind of frameworks but still very relevant to my learning and the sense of connection. Well beyond this tiny little space that you could only get to if somebody chose to drive you by bus or by car or tractor, I guess. So those lessons, I think, translated. And then I was on my own quite early. So I went off as an emancipated minor at 16, 17, living on my own for the first time in a city, and then moving to Toronto for school, 18, 19. Very, very, very difficult experiences moving to Toronto's North End, and trying to start university in a very impoverished way. So again, all the ways that necessity creates connection if you let it, as opposed to making it internal problems. So not to say that those were there were great difficulties that took many years to resolve in some ways, in terms of connecting to addiction, and just sense of self-worth that was diminished in those years. So you find your way back with purpose, and I think and that's not a one-time thing. That's an ongoing thing. Yeah. So we find our way back with our purpose and what we're committed to. And I think, I don't know, I don't envy a position or a personality that doesn't have external goals. It doesn't have goals outside of what I want or what I need. It's the opposite. It's funny because it's framed as a selfish thing, but I actually think it's an undermining of the self when we think like that. So I've always been accompanied or been comforted by purpose beyond myself. And I hope that doesn't sound like, I say romantic or just like somehow this special state of being. I think it's come about as a very practical thing for me, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, and then sorry, I just
yeah, go ahead.
But just very briefly, I would say I also got involved in all sorts of organizations and campaigns and things, and so there was lots of learning. I mentioned like Greenpeace. I worked for Greenpeace in my late teens. I worked with. I was very involved in HIV and AIDS education. I had a family member die when I was young, and just learned what that was. I had a great number of queer community and in my family. So very early on, had to work through my own bigotedness that I had inherited, and thinking through, what really were these strong, powerful relations that were ways of relating outside of the sort of nuclear family kind of structures. So I was involved in a lot of actual organized things as well.
Yeah,
so.
Beautiful. Well, I love what you said. I mean, there's sort of this tension in particularly in leadership around purpose, and we so value being self-actualized, especially in, I would say, the sort of democratic Western cultures where the supremacy of our will and privilege, whether it's education and the wellness of our families and neighborhoods, our race, our sexual orientation, all those things, right? The confluence of those things. If we've got that sort of in our invisible back pocket, then, it just takes will to, drive home our own individual purpose. And what I hear you saying is that for you, I mean, it was born out of connection, both necessity and connection and deep care for something beyond yourself, to a greater we. Is that,
yeah. I think you should, okay. You should just kind of hang out with me and interpret what I say in these really, really organized ways, Jen. Yeah, that's great. And I think, it's that, and I think it's also just, there is, as you can imagine, or as you know, also a balance that has to constantly be struck, because one can be too deeply concerned about a we. To the expense. And there's been moments where that has had to be rebalanced for me. And they're not like dramatic rebalancing. Sometimes it's just a matter of developing other kinds of practices. So art, poetry, writing for me, for sure. But even things like a walking pedagogy. I have a dog, which helps a lot in the city context, but I myself am somebody who walks and thinks, or whatever it is that people do to keep your body, your somatic kind of haptic self connected to all that thinking stuff too. So, yeah.
How did you, I just love to shift maybe so Cec, you and I met in the downtown East Side, when the downtown East Side Women's Center was on the tiny, it's on Cordova at the time, the little single, it was on the main floor of a single room occupancy hotel, long and narrow, and Cec and I shared an office. And, incredibly busy and demanding work at the time. And you, I left Vancouver in the early 2000s, and you stayed at the Women's Center. We both saw this kind of transformation of the space in a new location. And then you continued to work there, where it continued to be a site of activism and inclusion in ways that, other frontline services, some could do, some couldn't. But how did you, thinking of this challenge of the I and the we and purpose, and in an extremely intense place of displacement, the drug crisis, the opioid crisis, housing instability, mental health, residential school, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It is one of the most intense places, and yet at the same time, one of the most beautifully connected, supportive communities I've ever been a part of. So what did you learn over these 2 decades of time in terms of this deep commitment to the we, in terms of the expression of your purpose, and also this tension of also staying well and grounded in the face of great pulling of yourself in probably so many different directions? I'm just curious, what did you learn through that? And maybe we could just start there and see where that
Mhm, mhm. Well, as you can imagine, it'd be hard to sum up what one learns in 20 years in any given circumstance. So, but yeah, let me see if I can break it down. But like, I mean, in terms of like, I suppose maybe I can just flesh out a little bit just the actual experience. So working at the Women's Center, as you say, starting on 44 Cordova there, and that long, narrow place of great conflict, actually, because spatially it was just this compact. And as the need grew and grew, that space came out of grassroots women organizing. And I want to acknowledge that. And there just continues to be grassroots, non-institutional kinds of practices that work through the Women's Center to today and through the Downtown Eastside community. That may or may not be about the women's center, as it were, and it has its limits, of course. And so what I think is fascinating is generative as an institutional organizational model is one that sure has to have its hierarchy and structure relative to sorry, just notifications popping up relative to its goals of providing services and hot meals and essential services to women who are entrenched, transient or street involved in with all the experiences that they come with, which is very hard work to do. However, the Women's Center, I think, was above and beyond, and spaces like it can be above and beyond when they also allow for or create generative spaces for community-based practices that are not about reinforcing the goals of the institution or the organization. And these can span all sorts of things. They can be activism, in the sense of committees or, elder committees, political kind of organizing spaces that are allowed to critique the organization, which is necessary, and opportunities for people to come together to make art or to do beading classes or to talk through grief and loss or whatever it is, but spaces that that are perhaps independent or run by other kinds of knowledge keepers, helpers, mentors, organizations potentially, and that there's this kind of weaving together a cross-pollination of different kinds of things spatially happening in one space. Yeah. So I learned from that model for sure. I learned always listen to this idea of service is fraught, and we know it. We know that when we help people, we are also helping ourselves in a certain way. For me, that would be I'm helping my sense of like balance in the world. I don't want someone to suffer. It actually pains me to see suffering. I want that. So it's not just I want to alleviate suffering, as it were, but I need that too. I needed that at different points in my life. So I see this kind of mutual thing that is like hard to. One needs to be very careful with it when we're in a hierarchy. So when we're paid employees or when we're management. So I was management in my last couple of years at the Women's Center. I left there in 2011, 2012, transitioned out, and then I took up work for 7-8 years. I see these 7-8 years because it's kind of like that 7.5 years with the Galerie Gachet, which is a artist-run center, but also a mental health and social service in terms of it's working with artists impacted by mental illness and disability, and also in the Downtown Eastside. So the management role at the Women's Center was by far the most difficult because you're placed in a very different hierarchy, scale of decision-making and oversight. This language, overseer, oversight. We can do that lineage really quickly, and being in charge of money. And so when one has the capacity to generate, legitimize, and then determine the distribution of money, in a profoundly capitalist society that values money perhaps more than anything, even as we don't quite understand what that actually is in a lot of ways. I think that value, right? But nonetheless, we worship it in a certain way, and in a material sense, that kind of power is not a light thing ever. It was never a light thing for me. So I learned a lot of different things. I learned what it meant to come in at the ground floor as a worker. I've learned what it's like to volunteer in the community, which I've been really looking forward to. Part of leaving that space after so many years was in part to create a freedom of return, to be just present as I felt compelled to outside of a work structure. I work in other ways now in other kinds of embedded art services in the context of the city of Surrey. It was also very demanding, just very different. And so I find my role in the idea of the downtown East Side community shifting. But I also want to maybe flag to the idea of the downtown East Side. It is a neighborhood, it is a space, it is a community. There is still thousands of residents there. It's also a nexus point. So it's a place of throughness where so many services and low-income housing are concentrated, but you have people moving through that space who may not live there or may not have homes. So it becomes this sort of focal point for elements and concerns and problems and trauma and oppression that exist all over. They exist in that person's living room. They exist downstairs, down the street, across the road. So they're not, we have this, we are collective, we here in society have a desire somehow to categorize pain and suffering and trauma and all those things. And the downtown East Side does fit that mold. But it's so much, it's more than that. Those problems obviously are more than that. And so what I'm experiencing in that neighborhood is also that networking. So who actually shows up to work on violence against women, who actually intervenes in policing matters, who advocates and makes connections to, women working on the same concerns in another city, in another state, in another part of the world. And those connections are all there. So the downtown East Side is this hyper-local, also is this profoundly international space in terms of what it connects to. So all of that I learned for sure. And then also just, a real leadership around different kinds of activism and coordinated responses. So we've talked about violence against women, we've talked about the leadership of matriarchs, but also, the destigmatizing and supporting drug users, active drug users, formerly or present, policing, incarceration, carcerality, food security, all of this stuff is manifest there. So I could go on, but I think, the endless lessons, I suppose. And still now, because the space is even more difficult in some ways, because those problems are more difficult, as it were.
Yeah, beautiful. And well, maybe this is I'd love to invite you to share a poem as a poet, a beautiful poet who brings the everyday alive in words. And I love about your work is I feel like you name the specificity of what needs to be dismantled without sort of, externalizing it so much that we can't grasp it. And I think what you're saying about power and about, the sort of awakening when you're in a position of power, especially in a hierarchy, whether it's a nonprofit organization or it's a company or it's a university, the power of decision making when you've got resources, whether it's, money, people, time, energy, matters. And so I would love you to read a poem. I know it's a couple minutes, so I just invite our listeners to really sink in and let this wash over you. And then we'll sort of emerge from there and enter to a conversation a bit about poetics and how poetics has supported your own sustainability of engagement through this time.
Okay, Jen, thank you. So the poem I thought I would share today is actually from my first book, which is just now going into its second edition. It's a very quiet work in a certain way, as opposed to my second and third books were really wonderfully received publicly. And these are works particular to the downtown East Side. So I think, given where we connected and met, that I thought I would share this work. And I think of it I'll maybe say a few words after.
Okay.
Common techne, plural, practical, flexible, nurtured on sour ground work songs, unitary hymnals of ascendant grinds, swash, salvage lumber, wax, binder twine. We drift, taking in water as an awkward discipline, the strays gathering tumult under bridges, small dot passages to mouth, service, rids, city, misery. And we swallow stone grit, and we get round with risk, and we rest as bodies of waved matter because we are home. By powder and lead, we are home. and this temperate bayou that's smelling of diesel and harbors less and less. Income worries less. Income's been offered up, grist to the mill. And this was a distillery, smoking all the time like the boys on the rusted red and blue tankers, anchored. Come no closer. Coalface was a victim of careless talk, giving donations, attacking on all fronts. Antiquity bought Gringolandia. Income performs corners, prefers live-in, work-in, espalier apartments. Uniform purges. This is a state of starlight tours. Sawtooth, salt heritage, ruthless menstruations, working still. These borderlines and motions and these tin casings, their greasy chambers drive by, eyes that slide by, articles, searching for articles for use and contemplation. Every want wins associations, economy, commonly, crafting things of value. Blood bugs, rival roaches, pigeons rustle, meeting after meeting, bit percentages stitch in light industry, residential ground level retail, commercial activities. Sally Ann and so on sprawls across sunny peaks. Playgrounds will melt. Where medicine grows, children are strong. May the day break. Kind, keeping six, witness, vagrant years of enclosure, intensification of throughput indifference, and who will work for bus tickets, travel-size toiletries, socks, and cigarettes. Enforceable order. Apothecarial front sick, back prospects, orange cap, pop, blot, land and remake, survival, indigent burials, wardly heart, wretch, surge, memorials are bruises. The yellowed sage and blackberries age behind the brewery. Old railway tracks end in bramble, broken faces living under the bridge, kiss, hand drippings, salt from an old man's rags. The waning gibbous lamp low 100 block and the sighing alder flats, branches woven above mossy decay, methadrone, bushwhacked knotted leaves and the pale undersides that expose a certain rain. Interrogatory hospitality in a box with good handles. Frequent visits to the mouth, upgrading irreducibly complex, but a mousetrap. There is no underground for these sores that are stories high. We are made for the night, and it could be better, but it could be worse. And harried passerbys comb quiet Appellate streets for small-scale tobacco. Ship chandlers, pubs, logging supplies, written on walls are mutters to mothers. There are loves, sharp in the distance, and the trembling fingers, digging for atoms, are blurs of resistance that are plump and blackened. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, I didn't think I'd be crying on my.
Oh, sorry. You know, and it hits me every time. It's kind of like a prayer, that poem. It's quite a bit, many pages longer, and just too much for today. But it's one of the more honest, kind of just what my eyes are seeing and feeling, kind of tales of the neighborhood. And it gets a little heavier in terms of loss and stuff. So I thought but sometimes it's important to put that on paper, I think. And now 10 years, this book is 10 years old, but I look at it now and it still stands to me, which is always a good feeling, looking back on stuff you write. So
you capture so vividly, I mean, all the beautiful and raw and the images of displacement and poverty and love and power and, who will work for bus tickets. The
travel-size toiletries, socks, and cigarettes is like the basic things at the door, and people come and volunteer to get those kinds of treats.
So how is poetry? I mean, I think we're all grappling with, sort of the overwhelm, and it's so interesting because in a way your poem is full of images that in at one glance could feel overwhelming, just the rough kind of textured nature of everyday life when you don't have the privileges of money and status and whiteness. It feels to me, I mean, it could feel very, and yet it doesn't. Like there's something in the poetry and your words that also feels very robust and present and rich and grounded. At the same time, the exposure of all the vulnerabilities. And so I'm just curious, like how have you stayed in? How have you used poetics and poetry to stay connected to something that enabled you to make meaning and make sense, and ultimately continue to weave your deep commitment to being for the people in your network, the neighbor downstairs?
Well, being for people and being for land, and being, and for values that are not about greed and self-interest. I think for me, when the gifts of poetics, or the gifts of being able to work roundly and creatively with your observation, however that translates. And in my case, I've always been a poet. I've been a poet since I was a wee kid. And although I didn't know what poetry was, but I wrote songs back in the day. But I think it was always, there's a difference in the kinds of writing that we do, and, with proper syntax and report writing and grant writing and, creative nonfiction or whatever, like these different genres, really. I once read a grant application for a reading, and people were just really quite bored and concerned, but at the same time, like, this is all I've had to being able to write, and I want you to know this is a creative writing practice. Anyway, an aside. But poetry, like, this is this wonderful capacity to weave in so much. So while you're staying the course to tell a story, to observe something, or create a narrative that is grounded, you can weave all the scales in. So the movement of it, like the actual systems, as it were. So the economy. I'm never without the economy. I'm trained as a mainly in political science and anthropology. Somehow turned out, but it's not surprising. I think when I think about the sort of depth of in international relations, this kind of stuff, like the depth of economy in nation state and flows of the broader system, they're always there in the work. I still see that, and I see where they touch down in real ways. Obviously, I see people and I see their interactions, and acknowledge, and that's a part of my everyday, is I don't turn away from people in distress. Even if I can't answer that distress, I still see them. I commit to seeing them. But the real grace, the real depth that is ancient, is the relationship to land and ecology and all the cycles that are well beyond the human time span, and will be well beyond the human time span, and deep time, and and that is necessary. And I think if you can't connect to that, it's something to ask. If you value it, why can't I think that or see that? And we do it, like, we have a house plant, and my hummingbird feeder up. We do these tiny little things that are, that's partly what we're trying to generate, is connection to that. But I see that, and I see that in the downtown east side. I see that on the concrete as much as I can see that deep in the heart of the woods. And in some ways in the city, and there's many writers these days who have articulated this in different ways. That I think of the beautiful work Braiding Sweetgrass, for example, thinking through the ways that medicine is possible even in the city, even once things have been poisoned and hemmed in, that things can be distilled and become healthy and healed. Things can be freed, and I see that all the time. And so those things, those are beautiful things to me. They're also deep meaning, and not just in terms of time, but also just what is the goal. In my life, I would love to be way deeply integrated into ecology, and absolutely more so than I can be in the city. But also, like, I'm looking out right now on the river known by many as the Stolo, colonially known as the Fraser, And this is a very intensive industry where I'm at right now. I also enjoy the aesthetics of industry. It's problematic. It's fascinating. But this river has its own like life. It's so old, and it will be so old past our time. You just kind of sense that. And so yeah, so I think it's just an actual real valuing of certain kinds of beauty and the importance of it. So I'll never set out to just tell a story. My most recent book where I try to tell the history of my birth father. And I knew I couldn't set out to just try to tell that story with so many gaps. So I took off on a journey exploring cars, automobile industry, roadways, highways, hospitality industries, and all of that history. And then, of course, you just deep into the metaphor and the analogy of it, new meaning comes through. I could ramble on. I probably should stop there.
No, it's great. I know we're coming to nearing the end of our time together. But what I love about what you said is this piece around deep time. And it's something that intrigues me in my work as well. And how, circling back to something you said at the beginning was, sometimes we can, whether it's our will or a sense of purpose for ourselves. And if we don't have the we can actually undermine ourselves. And so weaving that with this idea of expansiveness, of deep time, when we take a long view beyond our lifetimes, beyond the body of our work, how does deep time help us get perspective on in such a way that enables us to continue the hard work of social activism or social change work? And so I just love you to maybe comment on, like, how does writing poetry, how does language, how does this act of creation for you connect you to deep time, in addition to the ecology and connecting to the landscape? But I'm just curious whether playing with language through creativity is another way that you've sustained your own social change work.
Absolutely. And but I would parallel that. I don't suppose I really thought about it as sustaining my social change work, but what I do think is that I've sustained an education. And the notion of deep time, I think scientifically comes from geology, and sort of like thinking geological time is another way to put it, which is more secular for people who might be interested in thinking it through it that way. But yeah, I think I've sustained a study and a practice. And were I a science fiction writer, I would write hard science fiction, as they call it, which is to say science fiction that's based in fact. So I don't write poetry with metaphors and analogies that I don't understand. And so I use quite a lot of terminology, history, like biology, and I don't do that lightly. I do that after I've gone on a thread of reading and learning in these micro ways. And I love the micro. I love micro photography. I mean, just these. So we have a tendency, I think, again, back to the societal we, because I don't like to just assume the we that we're talking about. We have a tendency to center ourselves, in the Anthropocene, and sort of have this sort of notion of our importance. And it really is an overstatement, I think. And so I feel like what we're learning in those moments around the fine detail of all of the material and all of the sort of scales is something so much more complex than what we could imagine doing individually. Now I'm really rambling.
No, this is so great, and I wish we had all day to riff together.
Back to work. Yeah.
So amazing to be in conversation with you. So maybe just two questions to kind of follow the end of our conversation. Like, what do you think are the qualities of leadership the world needs now?
I think the qualities of leadership that the world needs right now are really diverse. And so I think it's immediately important to understand this notion of leadership in potentially a lateral way, and as having incredible diversity to it. So there's no one type of quality or one type of leader, even within any given space. and a really healthy space, in my experience, organizationally or institutionally, which are rare, by the way, but one that's working on constantly towards its goals in a way that makes sense to everybody involved, and is actually achieving them, often is empowering different kinds of leadership capacity from multiple participants. So it's not singular.
Yeah, beautiful.
So if I had to pick a quality, I suppose that would be it. That is not singular. I would also say that any of us who imagine ourselves leading something must be engaged in learning and in an ongoing way, and always from the people and situations that we imagine ourselves in service to. So if you think you're providing something to somebody, you best be hearing very clearly from that somebody what they actually feel that they need, and then taking that leadership. So often, for me, in my experience anyways, real leadership has come from being able to be quietly standing behind somebody else, beside or with a group, and knowing when my skills, something like facilitation, I like that idea. I mean, it's limited, but facilitating something as opposed to conducting it, these are important, but it's always a balance. Yeah, so that's, if I had to knee-jerk response, that would be what I would say.
And it just circles back to what you said in the very beginning. My purpose is on behalf of a greater we, and that being, your real commitment to, as you say, everyone, that there may be different relationships or quality of connection based on just sort of everyday practicality, but, coming back to this we and using leadership and finding ways of when you step in and when you step to the side or when you step behind is a discernment, right?
Yes.
A real listening, and following the lead, particularly people with less power.
Absolutely. And it immediately becomes a concern when we think about representation. We're in an era and a time when we can't not think about it if we're accountable. So, and we can't just place people in front in a tokenized way. So that sustained support is a deep practice in and of itself. But I also think we have to learn just to understand and recognize what is in the room with us. Sometimes we can't see it, or we haven't articulated, we have a coworker or somebody we work with who wants certain skills and doesn't have them yet. So how do we bridge that? These are all active things. And that's the thing that it's lovely about sort of that kind of practice, because there's always something to do. There's nothing worse than a situation where you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move this forward. But if you can see what resources, and I mean, in a generous and beautiful sense that is in the room with you, you're already on your way to something different.
Yeah. So final question.
Oh, okay.
We've been thinking, I know, sorry, one more.
No, it's okay.
So we've been thinking a little bit on Weave about how our experience of hope and how we generate hope. And I want to preface this by saying this isn't a conventional way of thinking about hope where everything's going to turn out okay. I'm going to have sort of the perfect future horizon for me or for my family or for my body of work. I mean, what I'm learning from the beautiful living mystic, Brother David Steindl-Rast, is this idea that, it's living in the possibility of surprise. And what I love about your work is that there is the nuance and specificity of surprise around every turn of phrase. And so how are you generating or living in this possibility of surprise?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that phrase. Thanks for reminding me of it. I'm not quite sure I know. I think there is some ways that's part of resilience is a problematic term when we condition ourselves to be resilient and we suffer because of that. But there is a resiliency in how I think about life that has not allowed trauma to define me. And that's not a heroic narrative. That's taken a lot of work too. But part of it is because that notion of conflict or that notion of trouble being generative, being always a moment of change. And so the possibility. So I love that. And I love that notion of surprise. And I can tell personally when I'm having a good day, because all manner of things can happen, in the day. But if I hold my patience and I'm open to what's still possibly glowing about some, this traffic jam or this, even a loss, when we lose somebody, where do we go? We go to the beautiful things that person had or gave or shared with the world. Just making these choices about being open to that. But I can tell on a good day because those things are everywhere. And so I think you're asking me how. I think I would go back to the practice that I talked about in terms of thinking about study, thinking about education, thinking about, and I don't quite think of it as meditative, but I definitely do think it requires thought, being deliberate. And hope, I've never been one to take too much of a shine to the idea of hope because of the way it gets rhetorically used as some kind of end goal. And I don't think this is a particularly hopeful world. Since I was born, I don't think it's been hopeful. I've seen so many terrible things, and there are people currently on this planet who live in hell. So I don't really, to me, it's like, I don't know, we're lucky if we're not experiencing that, but that is a reality out there for many people. So hope, what is hope? Like, we have to find that possibility in the everyday. And that connects back to the sense of purpose. And that maybe it's purpose for the we, maybe it's purpose for a tree or the dog I'm looking around to you tell. But I mean, whatever one's goals are, I think they're all really, we put those all together collectively, they're quite beautiful together. So,
Cecily Nicholson.
Jennifer England, thank you.
Thank you for this beautiful hour together and for sharing yourself, your work, your poetry, your amazingly just gigantic heart for this world. It's what I deeply love about you, is you are the heart and presence and deep calm that you bring to every day is just so inspiring to me. Not inspiring in it's so rooted in what matters. And I'm so glad that everyone on who's listening to Weave has a chance to get to know your work. So where can they find you? Where can we find your work? You want to read more of your poetry?
You can find my books at the library. And if you don't have it at your library, please order them to your library. I like free books. You can find it through my publisher, which is Talon Books. You can order from them directly if you're interested. I have, if you're local to the Metro Vancouver, Coast Salish territories, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, which is not where I live, but where I often go through. Massey Books is an excellent bookstore. There's also the lovely Paper Hound and others, but those are Iron Dog's another one. So go support your local bookstore. Please skip the Amazon. I don't need the money. They'll take your money. But anyways, so those are some places. But certainly my publisher, you can go directly to them, and they also channel communication sometimes for me if people want to be in touch.
Thank you, and I can't wait to see you live in person.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much, Jen, for all your work. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much. Take care.